Okay, so what's going on, guys? I'm just gonna wait for the video. So what's going on, guys? It's your boy Ronnie. I'm sorry I was late to this. I didn't know what I was really doing, but yeah. So we're back and everything looks to be set up. So we're gonna get right into this. I'm gonna be saying Daniel Jones 1,000 times. Ready? Daniel Jones. 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 Daniel Jones, 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 Daniel Jones. Okay, that was 100 times. I'm gonna try and speed up. I'm going pretty slow, but let's see. Daniel Jones, 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 Daniel Jones. Okay, 20% there. So let's see. Okay. Daniel Jones, 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 Dan Jones, Daniel Jones, Dan Jones, Jones, Daniel 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 no, Dan, Daniel Jones, Dan, oh no, Daniel knows, Daniel Jones, Daniel, Daniel Daniel Jones, Dangenos, 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 Daniel Jones, Dangenos, Daniel Jones, Dangeno, Dangeno, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Dangeno, Dangenos, Dan, Geno, Dan, Dangenos, Dan Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Dangenos, 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 Daniel Janos, Daniel Janos, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Dangenos. I know. It sounds like I'm saying Daniel knows. Dangeno, Danielle Jones, 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 Danielle Jones. Talking Chinese right now. Danielle Jones, Danielle Jones, Danielle Jones, Danielle Jones, Danielle Jones, Danielle Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones. What Jones? Daniel Jones. Dan Daniel Jones. Dana Daniel Jones. Dan Hill Jones. Dan L. Jones. Daniel 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 Jones, 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 Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones. Dalian Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Dalian 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 Jones, Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Dalian Jones, Dalian Jones, Dalian Jones, Daniel 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 Jones. Okay, it's a tongue twister, and I just realized that. So I'm just gonna say Danny Dimes from now on, hoping that this will get a little bit better. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dime, Danny Dimes, Danny Dime, 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 Danny Dime. Danny Dime, 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 Danny Dime. Okay, halfway there. I'm doing this so slow compared to Mr. Beast, because Mr. Beast is a god. Danny Dime, 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 Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Himes, Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Okay. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Nines, Danny Nines, Danny Nines, Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. I'm sorry. Got my dog's hair everywhere. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Oh my god, my dog's hair is everywhere. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Sorry, guys. Okay. Sorry. So my dogs are everywhere. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Ooh, 666. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Okay. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Okay, 7,000. Let's go. 3,000. 700. 300 more. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Fuck. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes. I'm just rhyming. Ah. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Danny Dimes, 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 Dan Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes. This is so hard. Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Daniel Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dimes. You can see I have like a speech impediment, it seems like. Danny Dimes, 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 uh, Danny Dimes, 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 Danny Dime, Danny Dime, Danny Dime, Danny Dime, Danny Dime, Danny Dime, Danny Dime. Okay, guys, 100 more left to go. Unless somebody donates, then I'll do another 1,000. But yeah, donates $10 for another 1,000, $1 for 100 more. But yeah, Danny Dimes, 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 Dandy 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 Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dandy Dimes, 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 Daniel Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Danny Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Danny Danny Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, um, Daniel Dimes, Daniel Dimes, Danny Dimes, Daniel Dimes, Danny, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Dandy 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 Dime, Dan, Danny Dimes, Danny Dimes, Dandy Dimes, Danny Dime, Daniel, Danny Dimes. Let's go, guys. 1,000 times. Let's go, guys. That was amazing, and like, dude, this was not as easy as it seems. It was like I was stuttering a lot, but I'm doing this because he's a phenomenal play. He has so much potential. I don't know if people are able to see it, but he has such a great future ahead of him. The Giants got to keep him. He's been doing great, and I just wanted to do something crazy out there. And I know no one's really watching this, but yeah. Guys, remember to like and subscribe, and let me know if I should do these stupid videos like this more or not. But yeah, thanks.